spend the next 30 to 40 minutes or so talking about what I would consider to be the state of the art in terms of data for drug-based delivery for peripheral intervention. There's a lot of exciting things happening, a lot of new data sets that are being discussed and around the world. And, I can confidently say that Boston Scientific has been at the forefront of this, certainly for the last 10 years or so since their drug-based platform was in its inception. So without any further interruption, I'm going to sort of dive right into this. I think all of us who treat peripheral arterial disease, know that the Achilles heel is restenosis. And this is something that is initiated, at the point of contact, at the point of injury. And I think all of us who've sort of lived through the, non-drug-based era recognize that the benefits that we saw in the coronary circulation for anti-proliferative therapy were eagerly awaiting it to be adopted for the peripheral space. And so, clearly, if we could find a anti-proliferative agent that was safe and effective at the point of injury, that it would potentially reduce inflammation, arrest mitosis, and inhibit smooth muscle cell migration, and as its end effect, reduce restenosis and keep patients symptom-free, keep their vessels open, and obviously derive tremendous benefit by improving quality of life. So, as we're all aware, the first drug that's been used for peripheral intervention is paclitaxel, and it's been proven to be safely introduced onto both balloon-based platforms as well as stent-based platforms. I think all of us would agree that every single pivotal randomized trial that's looked at a drug-based technology as compared to a non-drug-based technology has demonstrated clinical benefit. And what I mean by that is it improves vessel patency, and it reduces the need for reintervening on the stenosed or occluded vessel. So it is a very reproducible technology. I'm not going to go into whether or not a balloon-first strategy is better than a stent-first based strategy. I think we all have our own little prejudices. Try and touch upon themes that we're now in a drug-based era. And I think all of us should be thinking of the concept that if we do want to give our patients the greatest, durable benefit, the greatest time for symptomatic relief, that we should be thinking about drugs. And I've certainly adopted this in my practice, and I think that all of my colleagues here in New York view that drug delivery to improve clinical outcomes is clearly the gold standard right now. I'm going to focus first on drug-coated balloons, and not to belabor this point, but these are the randomized pivotal trials that have demonstrated efficacy and have led to global approval for these products. And you can see that every single trial, whether it was performed in the U.S. or in Europe, has demonstrated clinical benefit. In this instance, as proven by benefits of primary patency. And so again, the introduction of paclitaxel onto balloons has derived huge benefits by improving primary patency for patients with symptomatic peripheral arterial disease. Now, the lesions that were studied here were relatively moderate length lesions, so-called task A or B lesions. And that's worth a conversation in and of itself. The balloons do not completely obviate the need for bailout stenting, which again just demonstrates that this is not a panacea, but clearly this is improving the outcomes that we're achieving with peripheral intervention in a very, very broad spectrum. So when do people think about using drug-coated balloons as primary therapy? Well, I think obviously when you can't use a stent, that's probably a good place to start. You either can't deliver the stent or the vessel's too small to accept the stent. These are all good ideas. But potentially areas where there are high flexion points, so-called no stent zones, again, great application for drug-coated balloons. If you put in a scaffold, you might block or obstruct a side branch Not a good idea if you can avoid it, obviously. There's clearly operators who have adopted the philosophy of leave nothing behind, and I'm not going to discuss the either benefits or drawbacks of that, but it's clearly a comfortable place to be for many of us. And I think it's worthy of consideration. There's a theoretical benefit that if you don't implant a permanent scaffold, that you could reduce the need for dual antiplatelet therapy and avoid bleeding complications. So again, these are all theoretical benefits of using a drug-coated balloon first. Some of the limitations I've already touched upon here. One is that you don't have full control over the delivery of the drug, and that's dependent on the excipient, the dose of the drug. Can you really be sure that you're transferring the drug to the vessel wall? Some manufacturers have adopted a so-called high dose product in order to ensure you have the greatest possibility for a drug effect, but it really hasn't been, I think, proven in randomized data. There's some concern about what effects moderate to severe calcification have on the ability of the drug to eliminate restenosis, and can that be the Achilles heel of this specific technology? As I alluded to before, you can't eliminate bailout stenting, and maybe if we could figure out who was going to require bailout stenting on the front end, we should just not even consider drug-coated balloons for those patients and adopt a stent first approach there. And then lastly, if the lesion is so long, you're going to need 2-3 balloons, maybe that's cost prohibitive, and maybe you should use a stent first approach for those lesions specifically. So again, just some considerations to think about when you're considering a drug-coated balloon first. So here's the 4 approved devices in the global marketplace. Of note, Ranger's not approved yet in the United States, but by all considerations, it's anticipated to be approved very, very shortly. The major difference is the size matrix and then the excipient. The carrier that allows the drug to be delivered to the vessel wall and facilitates the transfer of the drug into the endothelium after it's been injured here. The Ranger device, which is the drug-coated balloon currently being manufactured and distributed by Boston Scientific, has had a wealth of literature come out in the last 12 months. I'm going to start on the right with Ranger 1, which was the original first-in-human pivotal randomized trial, which was performed outside the United States, where 105 patients were randomized. This demonstrated a statistical benefit in terms of improving primary patency. I'm now going to shift over to the left column for Ranger 2, which was a global pivotal trial where 375 patients were randomized. Again, demonstrating clinical benefit at improving primary patency at 12 months. And then probably most recently, and I think most impactful, has been the COMPARE trial, which was a non-inferiority comparing the Ranger drug-coated balloon as compared to Impact Admiral. And again, this demonstrated almost no difference in terms of the primary efficacy outcomes and safety outcomes between these 2 different devices. Just to briefly touch upon the trials that have undergone peer review, again, Ranger 1 conducted outside the United States. Dirk Scheiner was the principal investigator. 10 sites in Western Europe conducted this trial. Medium lesion lengths, no significant differences between the cohorts, between control and the treatment arms. High rates of diabetes and smoking, which is, I think, characteristic for a symptomatic PAD trial. The lesions had a high preponderance of CTOs, 30% CTOs, typically task A and B lesions, as again I've alluded to previously, predominantly in the distal SFA. And again, bailout stenting was certainly not obviated in this trial at all. But again, another trial demonstrating the benefits of drug-coated balloons as compared to plain balloon angioplasty. Specifically here for Ranger 1, 86% primary patency at 12 months for Ranger as compared to 56 primary patency as compared to plain balloon angioplasty. there was a statistical significant reduction in TLR, favoring Ranger as compared to control, and no difference in amputations or deaths out to 12 months. When you look at, again, freedom from TLR, all TLR, again, there was a benefit favoring a Ranger with 91% of the patients avoiding TLR out to 400 days of follow-up, clinically improved as compared to 70% for plain balloon angioplasty. The Ranger 2 has not undergone peer review yet, but COMPARE has, so I'm going to share with you the results for COMPARE. And I think it's now an appropriate time to pause and just really recognize and congratulate Boston's continuing commitment to developing comparative effectiveness data. It's really remarkable that it's taken this long to reach this pivotal point in time, but this is the first head-to-head comparison of peripheral drug-coated balloons that not only led to a successfully enrolled and completed trial, but also peer review. And so this trial has been published. And so it's an incredible milestone, and it's another example of Boston's continuing commitment to demonstrate high quality data, demonstrating benefit for peripheral products. So again, Dirk Scheiner was the principal investigator of this trial. There was a two-tiered portion of this, the pilot study randomizing 150 patients, and then the pivotal arm enrolling a total of 414 patients. And we have 1 year follow-up this year. So again, the differences between these two balloons, we've reviewed this already, but suffice it to say, Ranger is a relative low-dose drug-coated balloon with its proprietary citrate ester excipient. Impact Admiral, a high-dose balloon using urea as the excipient. And so really a ripe opportunity to demonstrate non-inferiority for these two products. And so this did meet the primary endpoint. There was no difference whatsoever between the primary endpoint of primary patency between the low-dose and the high-dose balloons, again, demonstrating non-inferiority. There was no difference in safety as defined by freedom from major adverse events out to 12 months, again, meeting non-inferiority for the Ranger low-dose drug-coated balloon. So really an incredible milestone proving the benefits of the Ranger drug-coated balloon. By Kaplan-Meier analysis, again, no difference between primary patency out to 1 year follow-up. No difference in freedom from clinically driven target lesion revascularization, and no difference in terms of adverse events, no difference in all-cause mortality, no difference in either clinically driven TLR or all-cause TLR, no difference in target vessel revascularization, and no difference in terms of the clinical endpoints, in either sustained uninterrupted clinical improvement or hemodynamic improvement whatsoever. So it just an incredible study meeting the non-inferiority endpoint. So again, COMPARE is the first head-to-head comparison of two drug-coated balloons performed globally with different paclitaxel dosages and excipients for femoral popliteal intervention. World. So this wasn't task A leads that were, and again, it met the primary endpoint for non-inferiority, not only in terms of efficacy, but in terms of safety. And we're obviously eager to follow this trial out to 5 years. I'm going to shift now to drug-eluting stents, which has been on the global marketplace for a little bit longer than certainly Ranger. And I think when you think about stents, they certainly act as a scaffold, and it can obviate poor technical results and acute technical failures as a result of acute dissections and elastic recoil. So there's clearly always going to be a need for stents. Again, I don't mean to opine about whether stents first, but I think it's hard to ignore the fact that stents are really here to stay, and we're always going to need them in our armamentarium. So the Boston Scientific drug-eluting stent is obviously the Eluvia stent, which was approved in the United States in September 2018. It achieved CE mark in February 2016. It's based on the Innova self-expanding nitinol stent platform. Of note, this is a very unique scaffold in that it elutes paclitaxel through a very stable polymer, the most common polymer used for coronary drug-eluting stents in the global marketplace. And so it's a proven safe and effective polymer to elute drug to the peripheral circulation. Again, the PBMA is used in the market-leading coronary drug-eluting stents, and it's an excellent polymer to deliver paclitaxel to the peripheral circulation at the low doses that are listed here. Of note, as compared to the other drug-based stent on the global marketplace, Zilver PTX, Zilver, because there's no polymer, delivers the entirety of the drug dose within the first 60 days. And so if there's a late remodeling and neointimal hyperplasia that occurs here, there's no drug left to inhibit it. Eluvia alternatively delivers half the total dose within the first 60 days and then continues to elute the remainder of the drug dose through the polymer for the remainder of the entire year. And this was developed because it was recognized that in many instances, neointimal hyperplasia in the SFA and the popliteal arteries does occur rather late at the 6-month, 9-month time points. And so this biomechanics was developed specifically with the SFA and the popliteal artery in mind. And I think this is what's led to the improved clinical results that we've seen of the Eluvia product over time. So again, the paclitaxel dose that is packaged on this product is very, very low, certainly markedly lower as compared to the other approved devices on the marketplace, especially the drug-coated balloons. If you're someone who is concerned about downstream particulates, there's markedly reduction in particulate counts for Eluvia as compared to drug-coated balloons or the other drug-based stent on the marketplace. And again, this is a reflection of the fact that Eluvia is the only device that has a biostable polymer to deliver the drug to the vessel wall. This is just an electron micrograph analysis looking at particulate counts in the downstream circulation. And again, you can see that Eluvia has a paucity of fraction of the particulates as compared to some of the higher dose products that don't deliver the drug through a polymer. So there's a wealth of data supporting the clinical utility of Eluvia. I think we're all familiar with the Majestic trial right here in the middle, which I think got everybody's eyebrows raised about how powerful a polymer-based drug delivery could be. In the SFA, 96% primary patency at 12 months. This was the in-man study leading to the pivotal trial, the Imperial trial, which is a randomized trial comparing Eluvia to a subset studies that have been performed globally since the introduction of Eluvia into the global marketplace, including the lesion subsets, the New Zealand registry, and the Desfinado registry, looking at much more complex lesions moving forward. We now have 24-month data from the Imperial trial, and there was a tendency toward for Eluvia as compared to Zilver PTX, but it didn't statistical significance. There was statistical benefit in terms of primary to 12 and 18 months, but again, the confidence intervals converge at the 24-month point. There was benefit, statistical benefit, in terms of reduction of clinically driven target lesion revascularization, 20% TLR seen for Zilver PTX. That was reduced down to less than 13% for Eluvia at 24 months. No difference in terms of major amputation, no difference in terms of death, slight reduction in stent thrombosis, although not statistically significant. So the major benefit we're seeing for Eluvia is reduction in clinically driven TLR out to 24 months right now. And again, just demonstrated here on this bar graph, you see a statistically significant reduction in clinically driven TLR at 24 months with Eluvia as compared to Zilver PTX. In terms of the primary patency, I think it's of importance to recognize that the incredible results that we're seeing of high rates of primary patency out to both 12 and 24 months is seen regardless of the complexity of the cohort studied. And so you see incredibly high rates of primary patency in the diabetic cohort. You see high rates of primary patency in the CTO cohort. You see in the long lesions, the imperial long lesion subset at 12 months, you see greater than 90% primary patency. And then even moving into longer lesions, 20 centimeter lesions in the Munster registry, 13 centimeter lesions in the New Zealand registry, incredible primary patency. And again, Desfinato looking at 85% critical limb ischemia, very, very high rates of primary patency, 90% out to 12 months as well. And this favors Eluvia as compared to historical controls looking at non-drug-based technology for not only ballooning and atherectomy, but also bare metal stents. And so clearly, again, the idea that drug-based delivery has become the gold standard. If you're looking at primary patency, if you're looking at reduction in TLR, this is where you need to be looking in the modern era, without question. The mortality rates we're seeing for Eluvia at 2 years, again, this was, we don't have the ability to compare this to control as this was compared to Zilver PTX, but the mortality rate, 6.5%. This compares incredibly well to any historical epidemiologic studies looking at symptomatic PAD with ranges anywhere from 5 to 11%. So there's really no concern about a safety signal for Eluvia at present time. Obviously, the Imperial trial is going to have clinical follow-up out to 5 years, and so we're going to watch this very closely. But right now, there's absolutely no concern about safety for this specific device. Again, looking at the primary patency rates at 24 months, you see no drop-off in primary patency for the diabetic subset compared to the non-diabetic subset. Really just incredible primary patency, 86%. Calcified lesions, there actually is a suggestion of a benefit, 85% primary patency for severe calcification. CTOs, no drop-off in primary patency. Of note. So this is just a very, very durable implant that performs incredibly well regardless of how complex either the lesion or the patient's demographics are. And then when you look at adverse events, again, there's no effect of either CTOs, calcification, or diabetes in terms of adverse events. And so again, this device is clearly safe and without any concerns regarding safety whatsoever. Of note, in the diabetic subset, there was a marked, statistically significant reduction in stent thrombosis, favoring Eluvia as compared to Zilver PTX. This is of very significant interest to, I think, many of us who are very concerned about stent thrombosis, but clearly a very impressive performance here for the diabetic subset here. And so lastly, when we reach the 24-month report out for Eluvia, we have clinically significant lower clinically driven TLR for Eluvia versus over PTX at 24 months. There's excellent primary patency, which is sustained with Eluvia to 24 months, 83% by Kaplan-Meier estimate. The high patency rates seen with Eluvia are seen regardless of how complex not only the lesion is, but also the patient demographics. And so this is a very, very high performing implant. And we've observed very, very low mortality rates so far out to 24 months, demonstrating the safety of this product. We've now seen published in the peer-reviewed literature multiple registries, including out of Japan, Germany, and New Zealand. The Japanese registry demonstrated a marked reduction in late lumen loss, favoring Eluvia as compared to Zilver PTX. These are some of the representative data sets demonstrating angiographic data as well as intravascular ultrasound. And you can see how well the vessel healing is preserved out to 1 year with Eluvia as compared to Zilver PTX, where the healing is very irregular and there's significant neointimal hyperplasia and tissue ingrowth at the level of the Zilver PTX implant. So again, it really does appear to improve the way the vessel heals by using the prolonged drug elution with the polymer. And again, just a zoomed in view, looking at the different healing rates between Eluvia and Zilver PTX. The Munster registry, 20 centimeter lesions, 50% critical limb ischemia, 40% moderate and severely calcified, 80% CTOs, greater than 80% primary patency out to 1 year. Really remarkable clinical outcomes for probably the most complex lesion subset to date. Shifting to New Zealand, 10 centimeter lesion lengths, over 50% CTOs, very, very, very high primary patency rates out past 2 years, 94% primary patency at 2 years, very, very high rates of freedom from TLR, 94% freedom from TLR out to 2 years. Again, this device appears to be doing very, very well in New Zealand in a real world cohort as well. So to conclude, we have, very, very significant reductions in TLR out through 2 years compared to Zilver PTX. Boston Scientific to date is the only company on the global market to offer both a drug-eluting stent and a drug-coated balloon. Eluvia and Ranger are the only devices backed by not only level 1 evidence compared to control devices, but also to comparator devices. And again, this is a testament to Boston Scientific's continued commitment to demonstrate comparative effectiveness data in the peripheral space that allow us to make better data-driven treatment decisions. I want to spend the next 5 minutes or so talking about, a controversial issue that I think everyone's been grappling with, and that's this paper that was published at the end of 2018 by Konstantinos Katsanos, which unfortunately brought the entire peripheral space to its knees and put a halt on, I think, a lot of innovation here. The conclusion of this paper was that there was an increased risk of death following the application of paclitaxel-based balloons and stents, and further interventions are clearly warranted. The 2-year hazard ratio for this publication approached 1.7, 5-year hazard ratio approached 2.0, and there was an inference that higher doses inferred higher rates of mortality. Again, this was an incredibly controversial paper. There have been numerous podium presentations and chats about this, including from multiple regulatory agencies. One thing that I want to talk about is, how poorly organized that paper was. And it's of note, and most people don't recognize this, but the way that mortality was reported in the 3 trials that had 5-year follow-up was very, very different. And once the US FDA, unfortunately, was asked to get involved with this, they went back to the sponsors of these trials and they asked them to use the same definition for mortality, for death. You wouldn't think there would be different definitions for death, but there actually were. And to use the exact same definition for mortality and death within their trials and restructure their data sets. And this is what they came back to the FDA with, demonstrating, 16% 5-year mortality for Impact Admiral, 20% 5-year mortality for Lutonix, and 28% mortality for Zilver PTX. This in and of itself throws out the dose response curve completely into the garbage. The FDA agrees with this analysis because now there's a uniform definition of death. And this was one of the first major strikes against the conclusions of the Katsanos article. The second strike, I think, was when the intention to treat analysis from Zilver PTX 5-year outcomes was converted to an as-treated analysis. And as we all know, there were 2 randomization schemes for Zilver PTX that allowed crossover. And so when you look at the patients who were exposed to Zilver PTX and compare those to patients who were never exposed to Zilver PTX, there was no difference in mortality whatsoever. And this is the Kaplan-Meier curves listed here. And if you were to incorporate these curves into the Katsanos analysis, it would completely negate the findings and take away any statistical significance whatsoever. So a very powerful second strike against that paper. And so what are we left with here? What could there be something else going on? Could there be something in the trial designs? And yeah, I think you have to look back to the original peripheral randomized control trials, not drug-eluting era, before drug-based delivery, stents versus balloon. And it's interesting to note that 10, 15 years ago, every single randomized trial had a benefit for plain balloon angioplasty in terms of mortality. And so conversely, there was a mortality signal, if you will, saying that maybe bare metal stents aren't safe for multiple trials. And that was replicated at 2 years as well. And we all know we're still using nitinol-based bare metal stents still to this day. And if that wasn't concerning enough about maybe we just weren't performing trials well 10, 15 years ago, look at this trial, which looked at covered stents versus bare metal stents. And this trial at multi-year follow-up demonstrated a fourfold increase in mortality of covered stents compared to bare metal stents. And yet this device is still on the market. And I think this really does go to the concerns about what we were doing with peripheral trials as we were getting out of the gate, whether the sites that we chose were really ideal clinical sites, whether our level of follow-up and compliance was ideal, and maybe even whether the definition of death was even being used uniformly. So unfortunately, we sort of entered into the drug-based era with very, very poor track records for recording mortality and demonstrating equipoise as we started out here. And as we move forward, we're looking at multiple publications which call into question the findings of the meta-analysis. Here's one publication from Eric Sisemsky looking at Medicare claims with about 18 months follow-up, showing no difference between drug-based and non-drug-based devices. Here's another study just looking at drug-based stents, showing no difference between outcomes out to 4 years, regardless of whether claudicants or patients with critical limb ischemia were treated. Here's another study looking at a specific drug-coated balloon when almost all the patients were able to get clinical follow-up, which showed no difference in mortality out to over 4-year follow-up. Again, suggesting that this mortality signal is really not accurate. In addition to that, if the FDA and other regulatory bodies are going to say that there's a class effect, that there should be concern about all balloons and all stents, every single randomized trial should have a mortality trend. And unfortunately, that's not being seen at all. And so here's the 4-year data from the most recent trial that has long-term follow-up, the StellarX drug-coated balloon, with absolutely no difference in mortality at 4-year follow-up whatsoever. The 5-year data should be available very, very soon. But clearly, it calls into question whether there's a class effect here at all, and whether the Katsanos artist was purely a statistical aberration based on poor trial design and bad methodology used based on poor reports previously. Lastly, the Viva group did their own meta-analysis using a much more rigorous methodology with much better follow-up, including some of the concerns that I've mentioned previously. Michael was one of the co-authors of this trial, and they were able to bring down the hazard ratio very, very dramatically. You can see the trends for mortality are much more heterogeneous than were previously observed or previously inferred by Katsanos, suggesting that this is not a class effect whatsoever. There's actually differing outcomes when you look at trials performed outside the US versus trials performed in the US, again conferring really concern regarding the validity of the concerns of the meta-analysis. have data from the US VQI analysis, the vascular surgery quality registry, suggesting a mortality benefit for drug-based devices out to 2-year follow-up. In the unmatched cohort, when propensity matching was performed, again, there was almost no difference in mortality out to 2-year follow-up, but earlier on, again, there was a mortality benefit for drug-based devices. Again, really calling into question, when real-world use is observed, whether or not the conclusions of the meta-analysis were valid in any way, shape, or form. This was a sort of summary slide that closed out the FDA panel last summer. And again, after the initial introduction of the Katsanos meta-analysis, you can see the hazard ratio and the concern for the mortality signal has dropped down precipitously down to 1.27. The confidence interval almost crosses the line of unity. VQI, again, suggests a mortality benefit. And as we go into larger and larger subsets, not only CMS data with hundreds of thousands of patients or tens of thousands of patients being observed, or even a private payer in the US data subset, you see that there's no statistical difference in the outcomes whatsoever. And so I know this is an ongoing issue and every practitioner needs to grapple with this, but I certainly think that we've evolved dramatically in the last 18 months, and without question, the conclusions of the original meta-analysis have real concerns about the methodology and the validity of their conclusions. So outside of the meta-analysis, there's been over a dozen peer-reviewed articles just in the last 12 months looking at the global experience. None show a mortality difference whatsoever. The original hazard ratio from Katsanos has been reduced from 1.93 down to 1.27. And by the way, the US FDA concurs with the methodology used to bring down the hazard ratio down to as low as it is right now. We have the introduction of another device with 4-year data that shows no mortality difference whatsoever. And this all may be on the poor methodology used in the trials that were started 10 years ago. In more recent trials with better site selection and better follow-up are likely going to show no mortality difference whatsoever. The dose relationship has been completely discounted, and the FDA agrees with that there's no dose correlation whatsoever. The FDA cannot come with a plausible mechanism to account for the observed correlation between mortality and the use of paclitaxel-based devices. There's an ongoing working collaboration between physicians from all vascular specialties, the medical device industry, to develop another analysis, likely later this year, based on the wealth of data I've just shared with you. And there will likely be a new communication regarding the use of paclitaxel-based devices, likely in the first quarter of next year. And on that note, I'm going to close it out. Again, thank you all for your attention, and I'm going to turn it back over to Michael. Michael, I think you're on mute.
How about now?
I can hear you.
Great. Thanks, Rob. That was awesome. Great coverage of a lot of data and important issues. We have the ability to answer some questions from those of you who are on this call. If you shake your mouse and go down to the bottom ribbon, you can chat and ask us a question if you'd like. But let me start off by asking you this, Rob. So you've been in this field a long time. You've taken care of countless numbers of patients. You've participated in multiple clinical trials and have published and reviewed data. Did you see this coming from Katsanos? Did you anticipate that there was a problem brewing here?
I had no preconceived notion there was a problem brewing. I had no concerns in my clinical practice that there was a problem. I think that who reviewed the seminal pivotal trials saw these observed differences in the mortality rates. And I think, again, anecdotally, most of us felt that the clinical trial sites were demonstrating poor follow-up. on a lot of these patients, and that was multifactorial. It was either the sites were deficient in terms of their resources. There was a preconceived notion that the control groups didn't need to have follow-up because they had met the primary endpoint. And I think we were just all early on in the global experience of performing randomized SFA trials. And one of the greatest evidence of that is that even the bare metal stent trials had a major problem in poor compliance, poor definitions of follow-up, poor recording of mortality. Unfortunately, Katsanos, I think, captured the fact that the trials that were being done weren't of, I think, what we would call ideal quality, and performed a statistical analysis on this really prematurely, in my opinion, without consulting industry and looking into adjunctive data that they might have, and came out with a conclusion that I really think was spurious and wasn't thought out. And it's had a profound impact on clinical practice and on the peripheral medical device industry in general. And I think, unfortunately, right now we're all playing catch up. There's a lot of lessons learned here, but unfortunately, I really think the people who are suffering the most are our patients.
Thanks, Rob. There's a great question from the audience. What are your thoughts on the potential for drug-eluting technologies in infrapopliteal disease?
Well, I think that we're actually in a space right now where there's a wealth of data regarding the benefits of balloon expandable coronary stents for infrapopliteal lesions as compared to control balloon angioplasty or bare metal stents. And there have been countless peer-reviewed studies that have demonstrated benefits, largely with respect to primary patency benefits, but also reduction in TLR. And there's some emerging data that suggests that the use of that technology will lead to faster wound healing rates and even avoidance of minor or major amputation. The concern about that platform is obviously it's ideally suited for short lesions. And I think the predominant phenotype that we see for patients with critical limb ischemia are long, diffuse lesions. And so the question is whether a stent is ideally suited for long lesions or whether a balloon is ideally suited. Unfortunately, now we have 3 trials that have not demonstrated clear benefit for drug-coated balloons versus plain balloon angioplasty. And so we're stuck with stents. And again, there just appears to be reproducible data trial after trial after trial that stents work. That may be a reflection of high rates of recoil. It may be a reflection of the small vessel diameter. It may be a reflection of the high calcification burden. We just don't know yet. We're too early on. One thing that's very exciting is obviously the Boston Scientific Saval trial, which is a very unique paradigm. It's a long, self-expanding stent based on the exact same technology as Eluvia. So the same PBMA polymer and the same pharmacokinetics in terms of paclitaxel elution. That trial is still ongoing, but certainly based on the predicate data for drug elution on a scaffold in the infrapopliteal circulation, I for one am very optimistic about it, and I think it's going to address a huge unmet need for our patients with symptomatic critical limb ischemia.
Thanks, Rob. Another question from the audience makes you go against what you started off with. So the audience wants to know, when would you consider a drug-coated balloon in the SFA, and when would you consider a drug-eluting stent?
Sure. So I was sort of trying to dance around this, but I think that we have proven data for relatively short lesions in claudicants. And I think if there's something that I've very, very comfortably adopted, it's the task AB lesion without a very significant calcification burden in a claudicant. I'm very comfortable using drug-coated balloons. I clearly think it's in a patient's best interest to not be very liberal with stents in that particular demographic and that lesion subset. I think as you go to very long lesions, CTOs, the 30-centimeter lesions, 40-centimeter lesions, dense rock-like coral reef calcifications, I think it's very challenging to be liberal with the use of drug-coated balloons, because I don't think we have a data set yet that really proves that it's better than drug-eluting stents. So that's the way that I'm approaching this. I'm a believer that, you know, critical limb ischemia, you should be sort of all and done. Obviously, patients with limb salvage have a much higher prevalence of complex lesions, and they're sicker in general. So I'm a little bit more liberal with the use of stents for patients with limb salvage and complex lesions as compared to claudicants. But I think in terms of those two different phenotypes, that's where I try and start.
Great. Thanks, Rob. This is a challenging audience question. So two parts to this, Rob. Do you have any experience using the Supera stent?
Yes, I have a lot of experience. In fact, I used one just the other day.
Perfect. How do you feel that the Eluvia data compares to the data generated by Supera?
So the specific difference between Eluvia and Supera is, and again, I use Supera not incredibly frequently, but I think it has its role. I think that if you can reliably deploy a Supera stent to its predetermined length with very, very high confidence, it performs very, very well. I can very humbly say that I've, you know, deployed hundreds, if not thousands of Supera stents, and I don't feel that I can predict reliably how that stent behaves. I think there's very few people who actually can. So if you are one of those very few people who can, I think it's a great implant and it will work very, very well. If you cannot, I think the data has proven that as that stent begins to elongate, the patency falls off precipitously. And I think that's a reflection of the more challenging lesion subset that it's being used in. And that's where I really think that there's a huge benefit with all the data that I presented this afternoon towards Eluvia. So when you're looking at long CTOs, dense calcification, where Supera, I think, struggles a little bit, Eluvia excels. And so when I'm facing the worst of the worst of the worst, I as a default, go to Eluvia. I think where I use Supera is for a relatively simple lesion in the setting of an acute technical failure, probably after the use of a drug-coated balloon. And then, again, it's a relatively simple lesion, and if that lesion fails, I feel comfortable using Supera because I think I can deploy it in a simple lesion to its predetermined length. I hope
Great,
that's a
thanks.
helpful answer.
No, that was great. Rob, here's a question right up your alley, given that you were in the kind of hotbed of COVID. Someone's asking, during the COVID crisis, have you continued to increase your use of drug-eluting technologies to keep patients from having back into healthcare facility treatment?
Without question, that's the easiest question to answer. It was very, very manage my patients who were symptomatic when the crisis started. And I would say my default paradigm for anybody over the age of, I'd say 65 or 70 was stay out of the hospital. And it was really the patients that were unfortunately clinically deteriorating in front of my eyes, where I was really concerned about their safety. I would bring them in. And without question, I told them I was going to use a drug-based delivery platform. And the purpose of that was an attempt to keep them out of the hospital, to have the greatest chance to avoid the need for reintervention as long as the crisis pandemic lasts. And I think it's doing a disservice to an at-risk geriatric population to subject them to numerous repeat interventions. I feel very strongly about it. I took care of a 90-year-old patient last week, and it was just part of the process. Everything was going to be drug-based. The entire revascularization, the patient had a very, very complex wound, and the idea was to perform a singular revascularization, get them out of the building. We actually did it as ambulatory surgery, and have the patient follow up with their local wound care specialist in the office to avoid any need for admission or repeat visits to the emergency room, etc. And the family understood that. They consented easily, and they absolutely were a believer of the concept of improving the primary patency and avoiding any need for admission.
That was great. So one final question for you, Rob, that I think will drive this home for the audience. And you just mentioned that case that you managed where you talked about it with consent with the family. Given the FDA's most recent letter to the United States U.S. healthcare providers that says that you should consider this for use in patients at high risk for restenosis, and that it's got to be a discussion with patients about the risk benefits of drug-coated technologies and this potential mortality disadvantage. What do you say to your patients? Not necessarily the 90-year-old who you're trying to keep out of the hospital, but in general, those in which you believe a drug device combination product is best for them. How's that discussion go?
So I think it's a different conversation for somebody with critical limb ischemia or chronic limb threatening ischemia versus somebody who's claudicating. I've mentioned this already. I think somebody with tissue loss, who's facing limb loss, I think you have to give them their absolute best shot to heal the wound, and you have to keep them out of the hospital and keep them from having repeat procedures. And I think patients who are suffering with ischemic pain, who are facing limb loss, they understand that concept very, very well. We also know that their life expectancy, unfortunately, because of all the concomitant medical comorbidities, is just very, very different than somebody without active wounds who's facing limb loss. And so the conversation really is patient driven, and the patients who are facing limb loss embrace the conversation very, very easily. When you're dealing with a claudicant or a mildly symptomatic claudicant, somebody who can only walk half a mile or a third of a mile, it's a very awkward conversation. And I think it goes to the heart of the issue of how much the patient derives benefit in terms of their quality of life from being able to walk limitlessly. And everybody has a personal opinion about that. And somebody who you mentioned that there's even a questionable concern about mortality, who might only walk 1 or 2 blocks a day, maybe around the corner to get a bag of groceries, they might not say that that's an acceptable risk. Whereas somebody who's a active athlete, who absolutely their sole identity is their ability to be independent, and you raise all the concerns about the validity of the conclusions that I've just discussed, they might say, if I can't walk without limitation, if I can't exercise, it's not worth having that kind of quality of life. And so it really does demand a very patient-centered approach. It is not one conversation fits all by any stretch of the imagination. I, for one, have actually embraced the concept of bridging this gap with my patients. I like having these kinds of very intimate conversations. You get to know the patients much better than you normally would. And I think the patients appreciate it well. And they know that you're being very transparent about the FDA's warning. And they understand that you're trying to advocate for them on multiple levels. And so it's certainly not that everybody gets it, and that everybody wants to have it, but it's still, at least in my practice, it's the strong majority of my patients are still requesting and consenting for drug-based delivery in the peripheral circulation.
Well, thank you, Rob. I want to thank you for, again, a truly outstanding presentation and a great discussion. Thanks to the audience for excellent questions. I think you were really given a treat to listen to a true expert give a very clear perspective on how he views the literature and his practice. I don't know, Shelley, if you want to make any closing comments, I'll turn it back to you to wrap up.
Sure, you bet. Thanks to both of you very much. Dr. Lookstein, great slides and a great overview of the literature. I know that we struggle always to try and find a very concise way to deliver it to our Canadian customers, and we certainly appreciate your clarity on that. We're pretty excited because it's taken us a long time to get these over the goal line with Health Canada. And we're proud to say we're going to be the first country in the world to launch these two at the same time. So we're excited. It's complicated with COVID-19, trying to launch a new product, but your support here today, both of you, helps us to get the message out to our customers and to the patients that we want to care for. So thank you very much. And thank you to all the participants that took time out of their day for this hour. And, we have recorded it. So if there are folks that would like to re-listen, just contact us and we can make that happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Shelley.
Good night,
Okay.
everybody.
Cheers. Have a great night.
Good night.